So, welcome everyone to this World Report launch 2021 here in Stockholm. It's 14th of January and it's just past 12 o'clock. We have roughly 40 people logging in. We have 140 registers. We're still expecting more attendance to join, but we will start smoothly in order to make sure that everyone can join in due time. And thanks everyone who joined us so far. I would like to say this meeting will be recorded. So just so you know, and it will be recorded for purposes of being able to publish it on the social media channels. This is what we call in Sweden the World Report Day. It's a day that we have arranged for, this is the 4th year, in order to highlight the yearly Human Rights Watch World Report. The World Report was published yesterday, and it covers the development of roughly 100 countries that we work on. And we are today joined by two very special guests to talk about the World Report and human rights in general. And one is the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, Ken Roth. Welcome, Ken, to the talk today. And the other is Annika Ben David, our ambassador, the Swedish ambassador for human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Welcome, Annika. And just a few words on the program before we start. We will start by giving Ken Roth an opportunity to present the global human rights issues and highlight the essay that you will find in the World Report. You will find links to the World Report in the chat to the Zoom meeting. And as previous years, there are a number of essays connected to the World Report this year. And there's one specific essay written by Ken Roth that is also included in the World Report itself. And we'll focus on that. Then Annika Ben David, our ambassador, the Swedish ambassador for human rights, democracy, rule of law, will provide an overview of the Swedish priorities and what can we expect from Swedish priorities in the human rights area in 2021. Very happy to have you here. You are all muted, so we don't hear you now. But at the end, we will have an opportunity for all of you joining the call today to pose questions. And as you might have noted, your cameras and your microphones are switched off. So there will not be a possibility to put your question orally, but you can put it in the comment field. So we will take your written questions. And just as a technical reminder that when you put the question in the comment field, make sure that you change the default setting to all panelists and attendees, just to make sure that you put the question to everyone so we can see it. Otherwise, it's only a small fraction of the people here receiving the question. And we have large chance of responding to the question if you put it to all panelists and attendees. And you can put the questions in Swedish or English. That's equally fine. And you can put them to Ken and Annika as you wish. So we will start with this introduction by Ken. And so without further ado, I will hand you the floor, Ken. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Mons. Let me just also express my appreciation to Annika for joining us, and frankly, to the Swedish government as a whole for being such an important partner in the global defense of human rights. And I also just want to say a word about our vibrant community of supporters in Stockholm and more broadly in Sweden, which has become such an important part of the Human Rights Watch community. So I'm grateful for this opportunity to chat with you this morning, or now this afternoon. As Mons mentioned, Human Rights Watch puts out a world report each year. And it's a thick volume. We have chapters on more than 100 countries where Human Rights Watch regularly works. But each year we then highlight an overarching theme of global importance. And to be honest, there was little choice this year but to focus on the presidential transition that is underway in the United States. So that's what I'm going to comment on right now. And what I want to focus on is, I'll start with the premise that Donald Trump was a disaster for human rights. I don't think that's even controversial at this stage. He flouted human rights at home, and he embraced friendly autocrats around the world. The consequence of this was that US credibility on human rights was utterly eroded. So even when Washington did condemn human rights violations in places like Venezuela or Cuba or Iran, the perceived adversaries of Trump, there was no credibility there because Trump was so busy at the same time praising the likes of Egypt or Saudi Arabia or Israel. And so, after 4 years of Trump's utter indifference, if not outright hostility to human rights, clearly Joe Biden's election provides an opportunity for change, an opportunity for something different. But what we really want to stress is that Joe Biden's election is not enough. It's not a panacea in its own right. And the reason for this is that if you look back over recent decades, each new president in the White House has brought a huge shift in US human rights policy. And what I'm hearing from many pro-rights leaders in Europe, and I suspect many people in Stockholm feel exactly the same way, they say, how can we depend on Washington? And it's a fair question. Now, the good news that I want to stress to begin with is that other governments, many other governments, treated the lack of reliability in Washington not as reason for despair, but as reason for resolve. They, fortunately recognized that human rights were too important to abandon just because Trump did. And so, even though we have big adversaries, China, Russia, they were trying to undermine the global human rights system, what we saw is that a group of governments, sometimes quite new to this role, assumed leadership roles. And this, global coalition arguably made the defense of human rights even stronger. So let me just begin by giving a few examples of how this happened, new leaders that came to the fore. And I'll start with Latin America, because in Latin America, traditionally, governments never criticized each other's human rights practices because that was something that Washington did, and it was seen as Yankee imperialism. That changed in the last 4 years when a group of Latin American democracies plus Canada came together in something that was known as the Lima Group and really led the charge defending human rights in Venezuela, despite the abysmal performance of Nicolas Maduro. We saw something similar with the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, currently 56 Muslim majority nations. They, at the United Nations, never defended human rights other than in Israel. But that changed with Myanmar's persecution of the Rohingya Muslims, where the OIC, working with the European Union, really took the lead, including an OIC member bringing a genocide case before the World Court against Myanmar. And so we see this over and over. There was a broad range of European governments that joined together with others to condemn human rights abuses in China and Saudi Arabia. The European Union took the lead, not entirely successfully, with respect to the autocratic trends in Hungary and Poland. They pressed to force Lukashenko in Belarus to allow a fair election. Germany, France, and Turkey combined to force Putin to stop bombing civilians, the 3 million civilians in Syria's Idlib province. And we even saw this, if I look in Scandinavia, a series of governments took very important leadership roles. Denmark led in condemning Saudi Arabia's repression at home. Finland led on Libya. Tiny Iceland led on the Philippines and Duterte's summary executions there. And so, the end result of this is that more governments assumed leadership roles, and the defense of human rights was arguably more robust, even without the United States. So, one message we're sending to Biden is the world changed in a good way. He should work to strengthen this global defense, not to supplant it. He should join as a partner, not suddenly pretend that the United States is a leader again. Now, one interesting place where this played out was with respect to China. And it's worth noting that, historically governments are fearful of criticizing China on human rights grounds because they worry about economic retaliation. And you could look next door at Norway and see what happened when, the government didn't even do anything. It was just the Nobel Peace Committee that gave the Peace Prize to Liu Xiaobo several years ago and faced economic retaliation from Beijing. So what governments are finding is that there is a certain safety in numbers, that if they get together, they can avoid that kind of retaliation. And most recently, we saw this in October with an initiative led by Germany at the UN General Assembly, where 40 governments came together to criticize China's repression of Uyghur and other Turkic Muslims in Xinjiang. This was a remarkable number. And what's interesting is each time a group of governments criticize China, China then retaliates by bringing together a group of its friends, the thugs and dictators of the world, to say that, China's doing a wonderful job in Xinjiang and to applaud its repression. But the number of governments willing to take part in that charade is diminishing. Just in the last year, it fell from 54 to 45. And notably, the Muslim majority members, the Muslim majority countries, increasingly want nothing to do with this. A few of them are actually condemning China, Turkey, Albania, Bosnia. But more often they're now abstaining rather than engage in the spectacle of having to applaud the persecution of their fellow Muslims. Now, these are very important trends, and China notices it. They are very concerned with their global reputation. They need it for legitimacy. They need it, frankly, to fend off criticism at the UN. And so it's begun to, we're beginning to see the difference. China felt the need to respond. They suddenly announced that 1.3 million Muslims were subject to, they didn't say detention, they said we're in so-called vocational training centers, the euphemism that they use. And then they said they've graduated, which presumably means that they're releasing some of them. Now, the latest is that they're releasing them into forced labor, and that's creating a brand new problem for China, because increasingly companies are saying that we're not going to import from Xinjiang in particular, because there's no way to guarantee that we won't be complicit in forced labor. That's the position H&M has taken, for example, with respect to cotton. And we're seeing this more and more frequently. So, Beijing is in trouble, and this kind of pressure is really making a difference. In Biden's case, his problem with China is that Trump was so inconsistent, so transactional, so unilateral in his approach that he actually discouraged other governments from joining with the United States. So we want Biden, I think, as is his inclination, to be more principled, more consistent, and much more multilateral in his approach to China, which we feel, has the capacity to really intensify pressure on Beijing to end what is really the worst crackdown on rights since the murderous end to the Tiananmen Square democracy movement in 1989. Now, I talked a little bit about, how Biden should act with the world, but there's a more fundamental issue that Biden faces, a more fundamental challenge. And that is, it's frankly not going to be enough for him to be not Trump, for him to reverse Trump in order to stop the damage that Trump has done. And what we feel is he really needs to change the narrative in a more fundamental way in order to address this, this oscillation problem, this problem of, how does he avoid the next president from being, another Trump-like figure and just undoing everything good that Biden does on human rights. And so, ironically, he has to start his presidency by thinking about the end of his presidency and take steps to ensure that the US commitment to human rights is less reversible than it has been. Now, there are various ways to do that. Ideally, he does it by legislation. The Democrats now will enjoy a very slight majority in the two houses of Congress. So some legislation may be possible. We'd love to see the US ratify the core human rights treaties that most of the world has ratified, but often the US has not. But that's really hard because you need 2/3 of the Senate, and that doesn't seem to be, on the horizon. One thing Biden can do is to let justice run its course with respect to Trump. And that's just a way of showing that Trump is not above the law, or as Biden recently put it, that the president is not a king. And so I think it's important to recognize that what happened yesterday, impeachment, is about Trump's fitness for office. And obviously a majority in the House found him unfit. That will go to trial in the Senate probably after January 20th. But impeachment is not about enforcing the law in the classic sense. And we need separately an honest criminal investigation of what Trump had done. Now, the reason I'm a little worried about this is because Biden was sitting at the table when Obama faced something very similar. He took office after the Bush administration had been systematically torturing terrorist suspects. And Obama decided not to prosecute anybody. He blocked the prosecution. He said, we're going to look forward, not back. He didn't want the divisiveness of prosecutions. But that left a precedent of impunity that frankly, said that the president is above the law and only encouraged future outrages. So our advice to Biden is let the professional prosecutors do their work. Let them assess the evidence without interference. If crimes were committed, whether it was fomenting the mob that attacked the Capitol a week ago, or calling Georgia election officials and telling them to find 11,000 votes, the prosecutors should move forward if they have the evidence that a crime was committed. And even though this may be divisive, it's more important to uphold the rule of law, even with respect to the president. And frankly, I would hope that the people of the United States can find reconciliation around a reassertion of the rule of law, rather than continuing to live behind Trump's big lie that he somehow won the election. Now, ultimately, though, what Biden's going to have to do if he's going to change this kind of large shift in US policy toward human rights, he's going to have to entrench human rights values more deeply in the American public. And for this, we ask Biden to sort of find his Jimmy Carter moment. Now, what do I mean by that? Jimmy Carter was the first US president to introduce human rights as an element in US foreign policy. And even though it was only inconsistently applied by Carter and everybody else, no president has been willing to repudiate it. That commitment struck enough of a chord that today every president has to say that they pay attention to human rights. Biden's task is to reshape public understanding in a similar way. And we see him having things to do really both at home and abroad. First, at home, I think many of you know that the United States is a little odd in this respect, but when they talk about human rights at the governmental level, they tend to talk about only civil and political rights, not economic and social rights. And indeed, the US has ratified the Civil and Political Rights Treaty, but not the Economic and Social Rights Treaty. The pandemic provides Biden an opportunity to change that because suddenly Americans see the importance of economic and social rights. They see the importance of having access to healthcare without bankrupting your family. They see the importance of having basic economic sustenance, even if you lose your job. And so if Biden can more regularly invoke rights as he talks about these core needs, he can help instill in the American people a deeper appreciation of the importance of human rights across the board and make it harder for the next president to do an about face. Now, finally, with respect to US foreign policy, our prescription to Biden is that he should affirm rights not simply as an element of US foreign policy, that's Jimmy Carter, but as a guiding principle. And by that, I mean he should say that and then adhere to it, even when it's politically difficult. And that means, frankly, transcending the double standards that have so often infected US policy in the past. And so, one example would be he could say, we are not going to sell arms or provide military aid to systematically abusive governments. I mean, that's a very appropriate principle. But then he should apply it even for friendly governments like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, or Israel. He should be more outspoken about governments that commit serious violations of human rights, again, even if they're friendly. So one example would be he should be speaking out about the Indian government's, under Prime Minister Modi, its encouragement of violence and discrimination against Muslims, even though India is going to be an important ally in the contest with China. And he should, at the institutional level, he should re-embrace the UN Human Rights Council. Trump withdrew from it because it criticized Israel. Biden should jump right back in and support its work. Trump imposed outrageous sanctions on the International Criminal Court prosecutor because she had the audacity to want to investigate US torture in Afghanistan and Israeli war crimes in Palestine. Trump should lift those sanctions immediately. So these are examples where if Biden succeeds in showing that human rights are not just an element of US foreign policy, but really a guiding principle, it'll make it harder, not impossible, but harder for the next president to completely reverse course. So to conclude, I'll just say that it's not going to be enough for Biden to turn the clock back 4 years and to say, I've undone Trump's damage, enough's enough. The world has changed, and so frankly must the defense of human rights. So, now that many governments have responded to Trump's abandonment of human rights and assumed leadership roles themselves, Biden should join that enhanced defense of rights, not seek to supplant it. Meanwhile, I think Biden has to recognize that these, traditional shifts in US policy on human rights have become a crisis of credibility because Trump took them to such an extreme. And so Biden should seek to reframe US public appreciation of human rights so that Washington's commitment becomes much more entrenched in a way that his successors will have a harder time reversing. That will make it much harder for some future president, we hope, to resume Trump's frontal attacks on US democracy and the human rights cause around the world. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken, very much. And thank you for this introduction. And you're touching on several issues that are engaging people. And we see an increased activity in the chat. That's great. Please continue to put questions. We already received a number of them. So we will come back to them. And it's on China, on religious freedoms, on Samantha Power, on Biden administration, and a lot more. But we will come back to that after. I would like to invite Annika Ben David, the Swedish ambassador for human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, who has promised us to bring the focus a little more closer to home, to Sweden, and talk to us a little bit what can we expect from this year. Given the trends that we've seen in 2020, what kind of priorities can we see in 2021 from Sweden? So Annika, please.
Thank you very much, Måns, and good afternoon to everyone. Hello, Ken, very nice to see you, and hello to our audience. I'm grateful that you have invited me to this important event that starts the new year, together with Executive Director Roth, allowing us to reflect together and together with the audience on the past year and the prospects for 2021. And a special thank you, Måns, for introducing me our human rights ambassador. That's very flattering. And I think it goes to show how close the partnership is since decades in Sweden between government and civil society. Human rights defenders are indispensable partners to official Sweden when we formulate policy, when we execute policy. Policy becomes stronger, better, and more sustainable this way. So thank you for that Freudian slip, perhaps. Now, as you said, Måns, this is an opportunity to talk about what Sweden sees and does around the world in terms of promoting and protecting human rights and what our priorities are for 2021. And just to start with, I think we exit a year that has been a major stress test for the world, a truly global challenge. The coronavirus has affected virtually every individual on our planet. And among many things, the pandemic has accelerated the trend of democratic backsliding and increased challenges to human rights and the rule of law that we have seen for a decade or more now. In 2020, we saw continued challenges to the rules-based world order. Multilateralism was tested. Geopolitics were impacted. There was acute food shortage, unemployment, marginalized persons finding themselves in increasingly vulnerable situations. There was a surge of violence against women during quarantine, and some states have used and continue to use the situation as a pretext to restrict human rights and further undermining democracy and its institutions. Our partners at the Varieties for Democracy Institute at Gothenburg University have presented research that says that the situation for democracy and human rights worsened in more than 80 countries during 2020. In 144 countries, there were severe infringements on press freedom, for example. The majority were already authoritarian states, but 14 of them are established solid democracies who have restricted information, stifled criticism, for example, through internet shutdowns and emergency laws. We see the situation today when Uganda goes to the polls and there's been a shutdown of social media. And there has been a surge of disinformation and misinformation. I think that the latter will be at the center of many policy discussions for the months to come and the year to come. Disinformation and misinformation are threats to democracy. My government's take on democracy is that it's based on the presumption that the free exchange of ideas and opinions will lead a political community to take the best collective decisions for the common good. And if the information fails, so does democracy. It's like fueling a car with diesel instead of gas. Disinformation is therefore divisive and potentially dangerous. And not least now in terms of a global crisis, I allude to the pandemic, or in situations of tension and conflict in and between states, media and journalism are among the first casualties. So I think that in this context, in this rapidly changing reality, we need to make sure to ensure transparency and access to reliable and factual information. Just a couple of days ago in the New York Times, Professor Timothy Snyder put the question, can liberal democracy survive the post-truth world? What he calls for, or called for then, was, I quote, a thoughtful repluralization of media and commitment to facts as a public good. He referred to the situation in the United States, and Ken Roth did the same. What we've seen there, I think, is only the climax of a worrying trend, worrying developments happening globally in recent years. All over the world, there are political leaders in opposition and also increasingly in power, ready to undermine democratic principles and institutions. But let me also say that what happened in Washington a week ago was shocking. It was shocking, and it underscores that democracy can never be taken for granted. It needs to be protected, nurtured, and supported every day. And as big democracies, the European Union and the United States form extremely important counterweights to authoritarian tendencies around the world. So that democracy is robust and healthy and well-functioning in our own countries is essential and of existential importance. This is why Sweden last year launched, as I hope you know, a major new foreign policy initiative, the campaign Drive for Democracy, that mobilizes our entire foreign service. Through diplomatic activity, including a series of so-called democracy talks in Stockholm and around the world, we work to promote and strengthen democracy and the aspects that, in our view, must be part of a sustainable democracy: human rights, equality, participation, sustainable development, inclusive growth, governance, and security. What we want to do is to establish a counter narrative to what we see around the world, a global democratic backsliding, and doing so by highlighting the role of democracy for human rights, equality, participation, etc. We have particularly focused on supporting civil society actors, human rights defenders, trade union leaders. We think their role is central to upholding democracy and to holding leaders and governments to account. And this includes strengthening free and independent media and the safety of journalists and media workers. We are working in partnership with other states, with civil society, with international organizations and knowledge centers to defend democracy's principles, institutions, and defenders, democracy's voice bearers, as we call them. So we will work, continue to work to provide support and sustenance wherever democracy can grow, and we will continue to express criticism when it's eroded. On an EU level, we have strengthened our capacity also to respond to these challenges by adopting in December a new European Democracy Action Plan, a first of its kind. Now, to conclude, we exit a very troubled year, but we do so with great resolve and also encouraged by what Ken Roth said about first the pushback against the pushbackers, the resilience and courage of human rights defenders all over the world to hold their leaders to account, and also by the fact that Ken also alluded to, that more governments are now assuming leadership roles in all parts of the world. And for Sweden, we have a new important platform at our disposal, because this year we entered the new year as chairpersons of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the world's largest regional security organization, where human rights are an indispensable part of its work, an indispensable part of the comprehensive concept of security. No security without human rights. Now, the OSCE is built on commitments and principles that, if they were implemented, they could bring peace, stability, and respect for human rights in our region. Human rights and civil society participation are pillars of the OSCE. But as we all know, the OSCE region is facing major challenges. We have situations where international law is not respected. There are lingering unresolved conflicts. Democracy and human rights are increasingly being questioned, and gender equality is not progressing. So we will work as chairpersons of the OSCE in 2021 to make the OSCE a crucial multilateral platform, the platform it can be to tackle these challenges and to build stronger societies together. So to conclude, Sweden will continue in 2021 to push for democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, cornerstones in our own foreign policy since many decades. We will work for a rules-based international order with multilateral cooperation at its core. And we hope to be able to come out of the pandemic this year. And until then, we need to be vigilant and to make sure to prevent that the pandemic does not become a breeding ground for government overreach. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Annika. Thank you very much for this overview. And I would like to emphasize the good cooperation we have. I'm grateful for your participation today. And we have sometimes overlapping interest in securing equal rights for all. And sometimes we will be the troublesome watchdog barking at you and urging Sweden to be an even stronger voice, even braver voice, and also raising complicated but sometimes necessary country situations in multilateral context where we think it's needed. So thanks very much. And the questions are pouring in, and I want to make sure that we have time to respond to them. So I want to start off with a set of questions that are directed to both of you, to Ken and to Annika. And they concern some of the issues we have touched upon and some issues that we not yet have had the chance to talk about. And the first one is on religious freedom. And the question is based on the fact that Sudan took historic step this year to repeal an apostasy law. And the question is as follows: what steps are Human Rights Watch and Sweden doing to promote the rights and to adopt or leave a religion or belief? That is the controversial freedom of religion. It means that you can actually also deny the beliefs that you are handed over, or the context that you're living in. So what steps are Sweden taking to promote the rights, and Human Rights Watch taking to promote the rights to adopt or leave a religion or belief? Well, given that over 10 countries still have the death penalty for apostasy or blasphemy. And the second question, which is touching upon the role of the United Nations, is reads like the follow. The UN Secretary General Guterres, he announced this week that he will candidate for a second term. And what does Human Rights Watch think about Guterres running for a second term, since there has been some criticism that he has not stood up strongly enough for human rights? And what kind of attitude towards the UN can we expect from the new US administration? So that's a question that goes more to Ken. And I want to just group in a third question here. It's connected to the United Nations system as well. And it concerns a decision that we learned today, that Joe Biden is nominating Samantha Power as the new head of USAID. So what do you think? The question is what we think about the Ambassador Power, what she will bring to the table in terms of US priorities and work related to human rights. So I want to turn to Ken first. You can choose if you want to respond to 2 or 3 of these questions.
Okay, well, let me try to run through them, Mons. I mean, first, with respect to religious freedom, I mean, the premise of the question is absolutely correct, that religious freedom includes the right to convert from one religion to another, and it includes the right to choose to have no religion, to be entirely secular, to be atheist. These are critical parts of the right to freedom of religion, and we absolutely uphold that across the board. There was mention of blasphemy, and that is, the elimination of that crime in Sudan is just one example of this very promising young civilian government in Sudan, but that's still not really in control. The military is still in control there. And, frankly, the European Union has been a bit ambivalent view there, because they have been funding the so-called rapid support forces, which is the kind of paramilitary power that is in Khartoum. They've been funding them because they help to stop migration from Eritrea, but these are the same people that are the biggest threat to democracy and to this kind of progress in Sudan. So there's work to be done there. With respect to Guterres at the United Nations, Human Rights Watch, to be quite honest, has been disappointed with him. He, in his heart, I'm sure, believes in human rights, but he has been generally unwilling to name any violating country. So he'll speak in these broad platitudes, I'm for women's rights, I'm for religious freedom, I'm, whatever. But he rarely names a particular perpetrator. And so you've got to ask, does this make any difference? And I think one way to analyze it is, who feels the heat? If nobody feels the heat, then nobody's going to feel compelled to change. And because he so rarely names any government that offends human rights, nobody feels the heat. And his words are just, go out into the ether. Now he says, oh, I do, quiet behind the scenes diplomacy, but it's not like the Secretary General of the UN has any significant power other than his moral authority, his voice. He doesn't use that voice in this targeted way. He's way behind Kofi Annan, but he ironically is way behind even Ban Ki-moon, who was, started off timid and unwilling to use his voice, but learned over the course of his 2 terms to be quite outspoken in a targeted way. That's not where Guterres is. And so we hope that, as he's competing for a second term, that governments will really scrutinize him and say, are you doing what you should be doing for human rights? And if not, secure much clearer commitments from him to do better. Final question on Samantha Power. I mean, I've known Samantha for literally decades. There's no question about her commitment to human rights. She's been nominated to head the main US government development agency, USAID, and which is a new area for her. It's not an area she has any real experience in, other than her brief encounter with Ebola in West Africa while she was US ambassador to the UN. But I think she'll bring a human rights orientation to it. which is quite important because I think she'll be sensitive to issues like, women's rights in the allocation of aid, and trying to find a way to empower women as recipients of aid rather than just reinforcing, patriarchal societies. So I think she's a good choice, but this is a brand new field for her and she'll have a lot to learn.
Thank you very much, Ken. And Annika, would you like to respond to the question on freedom of religion and belief, or anything to add?
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely. I think that the transition government's decision in Sudan to repeal the apostasy law last year was a great step forward on the road to generally improve the human rights situation in Sudan, and it's a testament to the transitional government's commitment to human rights reforms in the country, and we have welcomed this step. We remain very involved and actively engaged in our support to the transition, and we fully support the efforts of that government. And we have also increased our allocation to Sudan in terms of international development cooperation in further support of reforms in this regard. We think that Sudan holds a sort of once in a generation opportunity to do better, and many challenges remain, but we are engaged and hope to be able to contribute. On the United Secretary General Guterres, I'm not informed of a Swedish position yet. Let me just say that we have worked and are working very closely with the Secretary General, particularly during our 2-year tenure on the Security Council. We were very pleased to see his call to action on human rights that was introduced in February last year about mainstreaming human rights throughout the UN's comprehensive engagement. We were co-negotiators of the declaration that was presented at the UN's 75th anniversary in this past fall, that puts democracy, human rights, and the rule of law at the center, and binding all UN members to live up to commitments and obligations under international law, and to work in the advancement of these. And thirdly, on Samantha Power, I think I've seen that we, of course, welcome President-elect's nomination of Ambassador Professor Power, and we look forward very much to working together with her.
Thank you very much,
Maybe
Annika.
If I could just jump into for a second. I mean, Annika reminds me of, this call to action by Guterres, epitomized the problem, because it was like a great statement, but it was all call and no action. He's done nothing to implement it in a targeted way. It's all at the broad rhetorical level. And that's what we need to change. He's great at saying, you're legally bound to commit human rights, to respect human rights. Wonderful. Now what? What's he going to do about the people who don't respect human rights? Not name them is his answer. And that just doesn't work. So we need to change this.
Yeah, and I want to acknowledge that we have a number of viewers from Norway and Denmark with us today as well. And we are working very closely with Norway, because Norway is entering the Security Council January this year for a 2-year period. And Norway will be a very important partner on many of the crucial issues like Syria, and not least children in armed conflict. So in the work connected to the Secretary General and Security Council, we will have a very close cooperation and collaboration with Norway the coming years. And Denmark is now in the last year. They have a 3-year tenure in the Human Rights Council. And we're also working closely with Denmark to make sure that they are continuing to raise important country situations, like they did when they held the cross-regional statement on Saudi Arabia last year in September. And there are efforts to also increase the engagement from Denmark now. And I want to just acknowledge that we also have viewers from Denmark joining us today, so welcome. We are receiving a lot of questions, and I'm grateful for our panelists to jump between all these issues. And now we have a batch of questions concerning China, economic and social cultural rights, and Sweden's engagement. And they read like this. So the first is directed to you, Ken. Thank you, Ken, for raising China. And what are your thoughts? This is a broad question. What are your thoughts on China's greater influence in the United Nations? And what does that mean for fundamental freedoms? So that's the first. And the second is, thank you for stressing the importance of economic, social, and cultural rights within and outside the US, but not only regard to the specific issues of healthcare, job, food security, but also as a right as such, where a duty bearer can and should be held accountable. And this goes hand in hand with the issue of social and racial justice. How do you see Human Rights Watch's role in enabling this shift, given that Human Rights Watch historically has had a strong focus on civil political rights? Well, that's the question there. What are your strategies to enhance this agenda? And third, then a question going straight to Annika. How can Sweden take a more active role globally in promoting human rights? So I'll let you think about that, Annika, and start with you, Ken.
Okay, well, in terms of China's role at the United Nations, it is very active these days, and its top priority by far is to prevent the United Nations from talking about human rights in a meaningful way. And it uses certain mantras. It talks about for a long time it was saying let's have a win-win approach to human rights. Let's have cooperative dialogue rather than condemnation. And what they really mean is that, if somebody accuses China of, say, detaining 1 million Muslims in Xinjiang, they'll talk about it, cooperatively, but they don't want to have anybody condemning it. They don't want any pressure, and they, so that's, they really want to defang the United Nations when it comes to putting pressure on any government to respect human rights. They also, and this is related to the economic and social rights question as well, they have a vision of human rights as subordinate to economic development. But even economic development in a very narrow sense. They talk about basically growth of gross domestic product. And so if the economy is growing, that's it. That's enough from their perspective. That is their human rights agenda. And obviously they crush civil and political rights. You can't criticize the government. You can't say it's corrupt. You can't say it's pursuing wrong priorities. You can't say it's covering up the coronavirus. You can't say anything. But even in the economic and social rights realm, it doesn't want an economic and social rights analysis because that requires looking at the worst off citizens of society and seeing how they're doing. It doesn't want you looking at the Tibetans in Tibet or the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. It just wants you to look at the big macro numbers to say China as a whole is getting richer. So this is an anti-human rights approach. And China is perfectly willing to use its economic clout, particularly the Belt and Road Initiative, to force governments to stick with China despite this assault on human rights. And the good news is the governments are waking up to this. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, more governments are willing to criticize China, and even governments that traditionally China could rely on are backing away from it. So I think that this assault on human rights is not working, but that's the agenda there. In terms of Human Rights Watch, we've been working deeply on economic and social rights for 20 years, if not longer. So it's this is a big part of our agenda right now. But we do take very much a focus on the worst off elements of society. We don't allow governments to say, oh, we're just building the economy, good enough. And we look at are they providing healthcare to people? Are they providing education? Are they providing sustenance so people are not starving? And these are the flip side of this is do they allow criticism of government policies when they fall short? Do they allow criticism of corruption when governments are funneling what limited resources they have to the Swiss bank accounts of their officials rather than to the needs of the people? And so in this sense, I see actually civil and political rights and economic and social rights as completely integrated. And that's the approach that Human Rights Watch tries to take in our work.
Okay, thanks very much. We'll come back to this issue of also kind of the economic rights and then business and human rights in a short while. But I want to ask Annika, if you want to respond to the question of how Sweden can take a more active role globally in promoting human rights.
Yes, and I'd love also, if you allow it, Måns,
Yes.
to comment on the question on economic, social, and cultural rights.
Yes, of course.
We have let's say we have a white paper that steers Sweden's policy when it comes to promotion and protection of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law in foreign policy. We have a mirroring national strategy. But this white paper, government communication, puts once and for all economic, social, and cultural rights at par with civil and political rights. And I didn't have the time really to talk about it, but one very important priority in our drive for democracy is a focus on fighting inequality. I think we need to reflect on the root causes of the threats to democracy, the dynamics that fuel negative forces, such as the ones I alluded to in the beginning. I think that the worrying success of opponents to democracy around the world is linked to the fact that there's an increasing number of citizens who don't feel sufficiently protected or respected any longer. We've seen the past year, that the worst hit by the pandemic have been those who are already suffering by marginalization, socioeconomic inequality, corruption, that harbor a growing distrust in authorities and in public institutions, that fuel increasing polarization, etc. So that is, I would say, economic, social, and cultural rights are part and parcel of our human rights policy and outreach. I said we work a lot with trade union leaders and human rights in the world of work. I could expand on this, but I will jump to the question on how Sweden can promote human rights in the world. Well, I think that we have a number of tools at our disposal. First of all, we are thankfully having a human rights policy that is based on, foreign policy that is based on principles and values. And I think that's a huge asset when you compare with other countries. We have a foreign policy that is underpinned by not national interests or specific security or trade interests that may vary over time, but we have what one could call a foreign policy identity that is to uphold and protect human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. And I think that provides us with a certain respectability, I hope, credibility as well. Of course, it exposes us to a great deal, and we are met with a lot of criticism and expectations that is sometimes difficult to meet. But I hope that when we talk, we do so with a certain authority, and we will make use of our chairpersonship in the OSCE to consistently push for human rights, which is greatly challenged in the OSCE region, even though it's part and parcel of the OSCE Charter and the comprehensive concept of security. And we will draw on our membership of the Security Council and the relationships and the outreach that we managed to create. We will continue to systematically raise human rights situations, geographic or thematical ones, in all our engagements and outreach on a bilateral and multilateral level, and simply let human rights take center stage in all our foreign policy outreach.
Thank you, Annika. Thank you very much. We are approaching the end of this hour, and I want to make sure that we have time to respond to the questions. You have talked a lot about one of the questions that have come in regarding existing inequalities. And I just want to flag that I think it's really interesting to see the question highlights the situation of minorities, communities of color, indigenous populations, immigrants, and older people being particularly hard hit by the pandemic. I mean, I just want to flag that Human Rights Watch recently put out a report on food poverty, on access to nutrition, access to nutritious food in the United Kingdom, a country where we have seen a spike of delivering of food packages to people that simply cannot afford to buy decent food. It's a problem that it is a classic economic, social, culture right, the right to food. But it's an issue that we didn't think would occur in our own backyard, so to say. It's striking to see, we see similar developments in both Germany and France. So the right to food in our societies is also an important issue to keep an eye on. I think we are now approaching the end. I will leave a last round of comments for you, Ken, and for you, Annika. And we, one of the issues of the economic and social culture rights are the economic rights, the right to a decent wage. And we are conducting a lot of work on business behavior and what we call the delivery chains and responsibilities for big corporates to secure that human rights abuses are investigated and also remedied in their supply chains. But I want to ask you, Ken, it was a question directed to you. What do you think will be the biggest challenges in the field of business human rights in 2021? So I leave to you now, Ken, to respond to that question. And also, if you want to make a final remark before I turn over to Annika.
Okay, well, thanks, Mans. I mean, I alluded to this a little bit in H&M's decision with respect to cotton from Xinjiang. But I think the big issue facing businesses today concerns their supply chains. It's no longer considered enough for businesses to say, oh, you know, here in our headquarters, we treat everybody well. The public demands that they look at how the products that they sell are produced. And not just the immediate producer, but going down the line, since obviously there are components that come into any product that's made. And what I think is increasingly demanded of companies is to ensure that their supply chain going down is clean. And that requires a serious due diligence effort. And I think ultimately it won't be successful unless companies stop treating their supply chain as a trade secret. The best way to ensure that the supply chain is clean is to be transparent about it, because that way it can be scrutinized and you learn, from the local trade unions, the local activists, the local journalists, whether there are problems. It's not enough to say, oh, we've hired one of the big accounting firms once a year to go inspect our factories. That doesn't do anything. So I think there is real pressure on companies to address the supply chain issue. And what's interesting is that there's a lot of receptivity for this on the part of the big name companies, because they know the huge reputational risks involved from having a tainted supply chain. But they are seeing unfair competition from sort of lesser known brands that don't get public scrutiny and can just ignore human rights in their supply chain. So we're seeing a push really from the bigger companies to have regulations requiring everybody to respect human rights in their supply chains. And that, I think, is a positive development.
Thank you very much, Ken. Turning to you, Annika, I leave it to you if you want to make, I saw that you want to make a comment and also a possible final remark.
Thank you very much. I'll try to squeeze that both things in. On business behavior, as Ken says, and sustainable trade, the Swedish government expects Swedish corporations, companies to respect human rights, and it is our assessment that Swedish private sector is doing rather well in this regard. There is an eagerness to do just that, and we are in close dialogue and cooperation, supporting their efforts. We have an ambassador for sustainable business, for example. And I also wish to remind everyone about the Prime Minister's initiative, the Global Deal Partnership for Social Dialogue and Decent Working Conditions, including decent wage, that now stands on its own legs, managed by our partners in the ILO and the OECD. And the Global Deal Partnership is also something that we are advocating for, that more and more countries will adhere to it. I'd just like to say that the time, of course, didn't allow me to talk about all the priorities of Sweden for the year to come. But of course, I cannot leave the meeting without alluding to the feminist foreign policy that continues full force in parallel to and reinforcing the drive for democracy. The human rights of LGBTI persons, sexual orientation and gender identity, a mainstay in Swedish human rights policy, the protection for human rights defenders. I failed to mention that we have increased considerably our funding to human rights defenders this year in the wake of the pandemic. And we have also topped up our allocation to contribution to the OHCHR. We are now the top bilateral donor to the High Commissioner's Office. That is just to mention a few of the things we strive to do in 2021. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Annika. And we will keep our eyes closed on the upcoming foreign policy declaration that comes out in February. We count the numbers. You mentioned human rights in it, and not only democracy, to reflect the focus on human rights in Swedish foreign policy. And we are a bit critical to Sweden that you haven't introduced mandatory due diligence for companies yet, but we are hopeful that things will change where now the EU is announcing that they will introduce mandatory due diligence for both environment and human rights. So that process is something that we hope that Sweden will be active in and make sure that there's a level playing field for all corporates that want to take a responsibility. But I want to thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Annika. Thank you, Ken, for enlightening us and talking about all these issues. Thank you, everyone, for joining us and being active in the chat. Maybe there are a couple of questions that we haven't had the possibility to respond to yet. We will do our utmost to respond to them in the comment field. So if you haven't had it orally, you will get it in writing, a response to your question. But if you like what you see, join us for more. We will come back with more seminars in our Facebook channel, mostly in the Facebook channel of Human Rights Watch Sweden. Join our community, join our Instagram and Facebook, even become a monthly donor and support our fight for human rights for all. We will come back more with new live streams on topical human rights issues. If there's anything you'd like to discuss, email us, interact with us, and we will see if we can discuss and raise your issue. Thank you very much. I'm sorry that we are a little bit over time, but I hope that you enjoyed this hour. And thank you everyone again for joining us, and wish you a good day. Stay safe, wash your hands, and stay healthy. Thank you very much.